Good evening, everybody, and welcome to V2, the Lab for Unstable Media. It's a pleasure of welcoming you at this special edition of Test Lab, the graduation edition 2016. My name is Florian Wijkel, and I'm a curator here, and tonight I'll be your host. The night itself will have two parts. The first part I will walk by every artist to briefly talk about their works, and followed by a small Q&A. And the second part will have an exhibition and the opportunity to talk with artists together with a drink.
From the beginning, it's more like a challenge for myself, more than my personal interest, because that time there is a lot of emerging questions about these democratic issues in Europe, and our main goal, which is like want to use design and art to reshape some like nowadays democratic issues. As a designer and also collectors those materials, so I selected one material from this collection, which is a flashlight, and to build one app. This is a smartphone app, which is called Flame. It's using flashlight as a language to communicate to each other when people in the dark space and have a very popular public discussion, and they can use this flashlight to communicate to each other. I think when you look some Hong Kong umbrella movements, the news, and you can see people using smartphone to communicate to each other, and also they want to have the common sense to express themselves, so they use flashlight. I thought, okay, this is the basic idea I come from. I would say because I add some metaphor of laboratory, because when we look for observation something and explore something, it's more like the way when we learn from the previous protest. So it's more like a scientific laboratory, which is also have the meaning of observation and exploration. So I thought this could be the way why we put each of the material into Petri dishes.
In multiplayer games like Counter-Strike, there are quite active voice communities, and so Calls of Duty is about subverting that open communication channel. And so I invite people to come and stage interventions within that communication channel, and I think it's kind of interesting that we're surrounded by so-called social media, information communication technologies, and yet we're less likely than ever before to encounter people or ideas that we don't already agree with. The first is, it's an adaptation of a Vietnam War protest song by Country Joe and the Fish called I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die, which was adapted for the Gulf War by the Chumbawamba offshoot, the Passion Killers, which I then adapted for the War on Terror. So let's see. Falling from bed, health deficiencies. A terrorist strikes less often than these. With nothing to see, we find something to say. The theater of fear celebrates doomsday. It started with that first song, I feel like I'm fixin' to die, which is a satirical Vietnam War protest song, which I think is great because it kind of sounds like a war song, but is actually making fun of that tone and that attitude in the same language that the kind of army people would use. And it was actually used in a prisoner of war, like in a prison in Vietnam on American soldiers, because it's maybe not the nicest song to listen to. So that was kind of the starting point to try and start subverting the tone of the game.
What I got to learn about this technology through some promotional videos that I saw about it, which were these super slick videos in which a future was promised that we, could all understand each other's feelings and really sort of look into each other's mind and sort of have no problems on this planet anymore because there was only understanding. And that sort of got me thinking that was highly unlikely. So I started to look into the software, how it works, and what sort of theories it's based on. and what sort of assumptions underlie it. And that's for me already sort of one thing that I felt like what's happening here. It's about emotions that are recognized internationally, but that does not mean per se that they are expressed in the same way internationally. I mean, there's a lot of sort of different ways in which we express ourselves. But if you then start to look into how machine learning works, how these algorithms are created, and those parameters are then fed into another machine learning algorithm which comes back with the emotional scores, which are already at that point twisted towards the, or at least in my case, twisted towards sort of the image you see on that side. It becomes apparent that these algorithms require images as input. And so they require tagged images as input. So they require an image to be fed in like, oh, this person looks happy, and this person looks sad, and this person looks angry. So there needs to be some sort of general consensus of what somebody looks like so that image can be fed into the algorithm.
I was dating a French girl for a few years, and we would go sometimes to her grandparents' place in the mountains, and her grandfather would be sitting there with a bottle of wine and talking about the wine or talking about the food, or I actually have no idea what he was talking about because I don't speak French, but then I had to pretend like I knew what he was saying. So in my head I'm thinking, okay, how can you act like you know what he's talking about when you have no idea? And sometimes I could get it, but then sometimes I was just like totally lost, floating around in the middle of the ocean, like I don't know what's going on, and but acting still like I knew.
It's a bit abstract one. I was wondering, how do we think, and how does the vertical logic think? How do we jump? How do we make conclusions? And how could we possibly try to visualize the language that we use on every single occasion, like the language that we use as the most prominent tool in communication? The idea is to explain all the words here by using a dictionary explanation, and then explain all the words in those explanations, and all the words in those explanations, and all the words in those explanations. So if you follow the vertical logic, where does this loop take you? And in order to explain these 8 words, it took 47,144 other words to be explained. And black as a first pigment that we use to notate something, and culturally we think of black as a void, as empty, as something absent, but we then use black to notate, to memorize. This whole idea of trying to understand something that is in between the lines got me to this other project. So these two are connected. And in this installation, what I'm doing is I'm using a signal from Jupiter. There are people around the globe who have similar antennas and receivers listening to Jupiter, and they make their observations available to scientists and to other amateurs. So I took one signal here, and what I did, I analyzed 144 central frequencies of this signal, and I'm measuring the amplitude. And as I'm sampling the amplitude, I'm getting numerical values. And all of these values are scaled to the book, so that every number that comes up has a word associated. And it's essentially poetry, which is generated by Jupiter emissions.
For me, it was a set of terms that we hear a lot these days, like artificial intelligence, like data mining, data in itself already, or big data. And from that starting point, from the kind of confusion of these words, I really wanted to dig into one of them and really see if I can make a work that is not so much speaking about the term in an abstract sense, but really tries to open it up and see what actually is happening behind these techniques. And it's often used by intelligence services to detect suspicious linguistic behavior and to prevent terroristic events from happening. So often they offer their services as a closed API or as a closed library, which is pre-trained already to detect, for example, depression in tweets. And by using the format of a workshop, I invite people to come with me and look into the software and follow a process to actually train your own truth, so to say. So to train your own text mining system that can detect anything that you give it. This is a writing exercise that reflects if text mining is either power, of course, and it can definitely prove to absolutely always verify truth, or if text mining is this impossibly ridiculous myth, nonsense, and a lie.
My work is called Conversation Piece, and it features 2 Geiger counters. These are machines made to measure radioactivity. One is from the western part of the world. This comes from America. It's a standard issue civil defense Geiger counter from the Cold War. And this comes from the eastern part of the world. It's a Polish Army standard issue Geiger counter. What you see here is a piece of radioactive uranium ore. So my research is based around the concept of invisible walls. And as I was going through my research, I realized that one of the most powerful invisible walls that there are is radioactivity. I realized something really interesting, that the Geiger counters from the east sound different from the ones in the west. By the way, what you're hearing on your right-hand side is this Geiger counter, and what you're hearing on the left-hand side is this Geiger counter.
I'm just interested because I didn't understand exactly how, because the sounds are not at the same time, so the sounds are not synchronized.
Yeah, the sounds are not synchronized. So on the rock, there are 2 points of emission. There are 2 deposits of radioactive isotopes. So in this part of the rock, there's a deposit of an isotope called gumite. It is a naturally occurring radioactive isotope. And on the right-hand side, where you see a bit of reddish coloration, that is carnotite. And they emit, so radiation works first of all, when you hear these little crackling sounds, these are beta particles, one of the three types of radioactive emissions. And when you hear a prolonged sound, that's a gamma wave being released. By putting these 2 pieces, the 2 pieces of machinery that come from parts of the world that represent, in a way, the 2 sides, my work is an invitation to reflect upon the current state of the world.
For me, classical music and musicians and sound artists take an almost limitless interest in new sounds, new modes of making sounds, or new meaning for sounds. It may seem, of course, a little redundant to put musicians and sound artists side by side. I am especially interested in sharing sovereignty over the performance moment with the audience. Many auditoriums are not optimal for presenting sound art because they are restricted in both time and space. This has led me to use more interactive ways, requiring audience to activate my mode of work so as to communicate more naturally. There are 7 discs. Each disc is wired with ultrasonic distance sensor, with a fan motor, and with 4 plastic pipes. Each host section attached to the motors is of a different length, thus they produce different sounds, which become our sound materials to be combined in making music.